Ben Norton is a journalist, writer, and filmmaker who joins us to talk about Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi's visit to the three Latin American countries. Ben Norton, welcome. It's really interesting how the Western media, in particular U.S. media, have said that Iran is visiting countries that are sanctioned, including Iran itself, painting it in a very somewhat negative light, where the whole point is just that these sanctioned countries, along with a lot of other countries, are all aligning with each other in order to stand up to what the purpose of the trip in some sense was, which is to stand up against imperialism, and in particular the U.S. and all the different ways that it has sanctioned countries, for example. How do you view this trip overall to begin this conversation?
Well, it's very important because it's part of a larger process of integration of the global South. Iran plays an important role in Eurasian integration. Iran recently joined as a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, along with China and Russia and India and Pakistan. Iran is in the process of joining the BRICS system, founded by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And furthermore, Iran is now building more and more links with Latin America and also Africa. So it's part of building a larger alliance in the global South of countries that have been colonized and oppressed by the Western colonial powers for centuries. And they have a lot in common, economically, politically, ways to develop together. And in the case of Latin America, this is also a very important strategic partnership because the countries that have been targeted by illegal unilateral U.S. sanctions have a lot to learn from Iran. In the case of Iran and Venezuela, for instance, Iran played a very important role in helping Venezuela's economy to simply survive the crippling U.S. blockade illegally imposed on Venezuela by the Donald Trump administration, which aimed to prevent Venezuela from exporting its oil. And Iran, as a country that has been illegally sanctioned by the West since the revolution in 1979, has been able to develop a lot of indigenous technology and an entire new energy infrastructure for oil production inside Iran. And Venezuela has benefited from that. When Venezuela was no longer able to import machine parts and lighter crude and diluents from the United States and Europe, Iran provided a lot of support to Venezuela to help modernize the oil industry and keep the oil sector going. In the case of Nicaragua, it doesn't have an oil industry, but there's a lot in common economically. And just as Iran and Venezuela announced they plan on boosting their bilateral trade from 3 billion to 20 billion, a massive increase, similarly, Iran and Nicaragua have a lot to benefit if they can increase their trade. That would be important for both countries. In the case of Nicaragua, which has a revolutionary Sandinista leftist government that also came to power through a revolution in 1979, the same year as the Iranian Revolution, Nicaragua has been able to develop its own sovereign economy in many ways. It's food sovereign. It develops over 90% of the food that it needs for internal consumption. However, one of the weaknesses of the Nicaraguan economy is it's still very heavily dependent on exporting to the U.S. market for about 60% of its exports. So Nicaragua is also looking to find a way to diversify its international trade, and Iran, as a big country with 90 million people, can offer a potential market for Nicaragua, so both of these countries can jointly develop.
Well, one of the things that Iran obviously is going to contribute to when it comes to these three countries, I'm sure, is the fact that it's going to help propel their energy, whether it's in the form of the petrochemical industry in Venezuela in terms of any technology or expanding it and refurbishing it and bringing it up to date, and in the case of Nicaragua, because Nicaragua obviously has a lot of natural resources. But I'm guessing, just like it did with Venezuela, and I'm sure it did with Nicaragua in terms of the number of MOUs signed, it's going to do the same with Cuba. And all of this is probably going to be trade that's going to be done not using the dollar. Are we looking at this in if you can put this in the context of this new world order that we're talking about, that excludes the dollar, that has BRICS as a grouping of countries with the addition of new members rising to stand up to what Iran has called the U.S. hegemony?
Yeah, absolutely. This is extremely important because I mentioned that this is part of a larger process of global South integration, and that is part of the process of the strengthening of a multipolar world. The United States in 1991, with the overthrow of the Soviet Union, essentially declared itself to be the dictator of the world. And if you read the very arrogant documents written by U.S. policymakers and political scientists and pundits, they declared the end of history. Francis Fukuyama, a well-known neoconservative ideologue in the United States, declared that it was the end of history. There would be no more human development. The former U.S. National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, wrote in his book, The Grand Chessboard in 1997, that the United States is the first ever truly global empire and needed to prevent the rise of Eurasian competitors. Specifically, he named the so-called threats in scare quotes, of China, Russia, and Iran. And now we see that that Eurasian bloc is more and more united, and through institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, it's also bringing in other countries in the Global South to build a larger bloc. You mentioned de-dollarization, which is an important part of this because it is the US dollar that gives the United States what's known as the exorbitant privilege in order to not only continue to import the surplus produced by other countries around the world while the U.S. maintains a massive trade deficit, so the U.S. benefits from that, but also furthermore, the U.S. uses the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency to impose illegal unilateral sanctions on countries and try to destroy their economies.
I'm sorry to jump in, Ben Norton. We're having the Iranian president and his counterpart. We're going to go live with that, but thank you so much for your input. Ben Norton, journalist, writer, and filmmaker. Let's cross on over now live to Havana.